All right, good morning.
Good morning.
Good morning. We'll begin prayer. So if you have any particular prayer requests or praises or anything for the good of the group. Anything? All right. No news is good news.
I'm thankful. There was some prayers for my eye surgery on Wednesday, and it went very well.
Good.
And so I heard you consistent. And good news, Disney all brought me butter pecan ice cream from the Evans City. There's a place in Evans City that sells Penn State ice cream.
Okay.
So anyway, I'm feeling much better since I had the ice cream.
Good. There actually has been a lot of studies done on the correlation between ice cream and eye surgery.
Yeah.
So you're a good test case. There are handouts right back where the Proudies are coming in right now. If you want one, or I have some up here if this is closer for you and you'd rather come forward. If you're just now coming in, there's a handout on that table, or there's the same one up here if you. All right, we're going to pray. Any other items just real quick before we get started? Anything else? Prayer.
Wes has replacement surgery of the shoulder on Wednesday.
So far, I don't have to write that down. It's Les and Wes. And surgery both. So far, we're okay. If there's anything else, I might have to get the pen back up. Anything else? All right, let's pray. Heavenly Father, we thank you. Thank you for a beautiful morning. Father, we thank you for the opportunity that we have to gather together in your name to worship you, to praise you, to learn about the world, the people that you have made in the world. And we thank you for the opportunity that we have to discuss and to think and to learn to love others better. And we pray that you be with our hearts and thoughts and minds this morning, both here as well as and also in the service, that we might worship you in truth and give all things to your glory. Father, we thank you that Les's surgery went well and that he is recovering well. We pray for Wes as he's going in for shoulder surgery this week, that you would help the surgery to go well, and then that you would help his recovery to be swift, and that it would help him get back to doing what he wants to be able to do. We just thank you for the way that you have gifted us as people to be able to do such things as this, and how we reflect you in all of our best natures. And we thank you and praise you. Be with us this morning. In your name we pray. Amen. All right, one more time. There are handouts on the back if you want one, or I have some up here if this is closer for you. Or if you raise your hand, Bob will bring you one. We're good. All right. If you were not here last week, then sorry, you're already behind. This is a class that I teach at Portersville Christian School, and so it is a class that's going to build on itself. If you are ever unable to be here but are interested, the way that we're recording for those who are at home right now, who aren't able to be here, there's the camera right in front of me if you didn't know that, and that's why it says I'm screen sharing right now. But those are being streamed live on YouTube, and then they're going to be on YouTube. So if you just search Grace Church of Harmony Sunday School, but I assume yours are on there too. Do you know?
They were on my channel. They will be moved over to the church.
Okay, so, and yeah, if you missed Bob's Sunday School last quarter, whatever we want to call it. Those will be on there as well soon. Last week we were talking about what is worldview, and on the handout that you have, I have the two definitions that we looked at most closely. The books that I primarily am drawing information from for this study are The Universe Next Door by James Sire and Understanding the Times by Noble and Myers. There's handouts right there if you guys want to grab right on this chip. We looked at those last week. I was hoping that I'd be able to get through all of our setup material this week as I was reviewing my notes yesterday and this morning. We're not going to get through it all this week. So probably this week and next week will kind of be our final setting of the table before we start getting into some specific worldviews. But the faster I get going, the faster we'll be able to get through this material. So if there are no questions, here we go. All right. At the end of the study, we're going to come back to these questions that I'm about to put on the board. We're going to talk throughout this whole process about like what is worldview and how do different people discover or determine or fall into their worldviews. But we also should be asking ourselves, how have we determined our worldview? Is it a consistent worldview? And we should be looking at that as well. So we'll come back to this at the end, those of you who have stuck it out and are still here months from now. But to begin with, when it comes to the study of worldview, when it comes to how we know our worldview and the worldview of others, humility is an important first step. None of us are perfect or all-knowing. God, of course, is, but we are not. And so it is good for us to approach these topics with a humble attitude. Now, humility is not the same thing as skepticism. Okay? Humility is not the same thing as being skeptical. It is good to assume that we can know truth, we can know facts. It's good to have that as a starting place. Since I believe that truth exists, I also believe it is possible to find and know truth, even if not exhaustively. Humility and skepticism are not the same thing. And so this leads to these questions and some things we've talked about a few times already. First of all, does your worldview possess inner intellectual coherence? Is it consistent within itself? At the bottom of that handout, I have these questions spelled out for you. And again, I encourage you to come back to them at various points. But the first question that is worth asking ourselves when we're examining our own worldview, how we see the world, how we live in the world, is, does my worldview have coherency within it? Is it internally consistent? Is your worldview able to comprehend the data of the real world? Do the things that we experience to be true in this world fit into our worldview? Does what we believe up here and what we experience out here? So not only is it internally coherent, but is it externally coherent? Does your worldview explain the things which it claims to be able to explain? For instance, every worldview must explain where morals come from. We'll get more into morals and ethics even this morning. Does your particular worldview give an adequate reason for why we believe there to be such a thing as right and wrong? That's an example of whether or not our worldviews claim to explain or are able to explain what they claim they're able to explain. And then, while definitely not the most important question on the list, it is absolutely worth asking, is your worldview subjectively satisfying? Is it, as best as you can tell, true and satisfying? Does it satisfy your doubts more than any other answer? For instance, part of why I believe a Christian worldview to be true is not only do I find it to be internally coherent, not only do I find it to fit the evidences, the data I find in the world around me, not only do I think that it adequately explains what I see in the world around me, but I find it to be subjectively satisfying. It best answers the questions of all of the worldviews that I've looked at, of all of the religions I've studied. At the end of the day, when I finish looking at Christianity, it feels the most subjectively satisfying. Now, this is not, of course, the most important thing. We live in a world where people tend to start there. Does it feel good? Does it seem, do I like how I feel at this point? Notice we're not starting here, but that doesn't make it not worth something. The very last bit of groundwork that we need to lay before we get into examining worldviews themselves is just to look at the system we're going to proceed with, what lenses and questions we're going to use. The first question is, how do we categorize worldviews? As previously mentioned, to some degree, every individual's worldview is going to be somewhat unique. That said, there are some broad categories that we can look at in trying to comprehend how different people see the world. For instance, the first major worldview we're going to look at is a Christian worldview. While there are certainly some areas within the broader Christian worldview where we can agree to disagree on certain specifics. For instance, some Christians hold this political position and others hold this political position, but we don't necessarily question that they are Christians, or at least hopefully we don't very often. Somebody might have one position on how the universe, not how the universe came to be, but the specifics of how the universe came. How did creation work? As long as we agree on the foundational primaries, then we can admit, we can agree that somebody is a Christian. So there are going to be enough similarities within these categorical worldviews to sort of lump people together. Within that, there might be some individual perspectives or some specific differences. But if enough of the similarities are the same, then that helps us to talk about worldviews in this categorical way. I'm going to be using a two-category system with one set of categories looking at larger picture umbrella identifiers, and the second category looking at more precise individual silos within or under that umbrella. For instance, at the beginning of this, once I'm done laying all this groundwork, we're going to begin with looking at a theistic worldview. I'm going to say, what is a theistic worldview? What do all theistic worldviews hold in common? But then we're also going to narrow it down, and we're going to look at specifically Christianity as a type of theistic worldview. And then we're going to look at Islam as a type of theistic worldview. So as we're going through this, sometimes we're going to be looking at these big umbrella types of categorizations, and then in other places, these more specific silos. Sire, the Understanding the Times book, I'm sorry, wrong book, Sire's Universe Next Door, he deals with these big umbrellas. Sire's book is really good at the big umbrellas, the big comprehensive worldviews that pull in a lot of different people. He uses 9 of these umbrella categories that we're going to look at throughout the class. Understanding the Times uses these 6 specific worldviews. 4 of those overlap well with Sire's bigger 9 umbrellas. 2 of them are very specific silos that fall under there. In the past, when I first started teaching this class years ago, 6 or more years ago now, the only book I had was the Understanding the Times book. And while I like that book, it's too specific. And part of what I was looking for, I think I mentioned this last week, part of what I was looking for is ways to sort of expand. My students who were graduating and going to secular universities would come back and they'd say, the stuff you told us was helpful, but it was too narrow. If you don't find somebody who fits exactly this pattern, you don't really understand what they believe. So the point of adding Sire was he helps us to ask bigger questions about wider spanning worldviews. And then the Understanding the Times book helps to narrow that down and talk about more specifics. I try to overlap these 2 things as much as possible within this study. Sire uses 8 basic questions, and I have them on that handout for you so that you can hold on to that, bring it with you, and and maybe remember these things. And they're just helpful as you're examining not only your own worldview, but others. Sire uses these 8 questions to examine the 9 umbrellas that we're going to be looking at. Now, we're actually going to go through these 8 questions relatively quickly, because then understanding the times uses these 10 lenses, and those drill down a little bit further. So I'm going to go through these questions relatively fast, but then we'll have to slow down a little bit when we get into the lenses. So first of all, Sire's first question is, what is prime reality? What is the really real? Everyone, every worldview believes that there is something or someone that is most real, that underlies all other reality. For some, that is supernatural, above or beyond the natural, something that is not clearly observable. God, the gods, spirits. For others, it is merely the material cosmos, which is the most real. It's the thing that exists as the most real thing that there is. This is a question which helps to set the boundaries for each of the questions that follows. It's therefore an important answer to establish. What do you think is really real? What is the most real thing in the world? But it's also really important, I think, for us to remember, to note that there is even a bias in this being our primary question. Sire is clearly biased towards a Christian worldview, as are we, of course. The framework through which one examines worldview necessarily shows what assumptions we carry. If we don't believe in a supernatural prime reality, then this question probably ranks low on our list of questions that we think is important in the world. Maybe it's irrelevant if we think that there is merely a material cosmos. What is really real doesn't matter as much. By making this question the prime question that he asks, Sire is asserting that being precedes knowing. By making this the primary question, Sire says there is a being that precedes our ability to know. As we'll come to see throughout this course, this is not a very capital M modern or Enlightenment way of thinking or viewing the world. People today tend to start with how do I know before moving on to what we know. It's a very modern way of viewing the world. But for much of human history, the primary question is what is, then how do I know? Because I happen to agree with Sire, because we are approaching this class from a Christian perspective, I think it is a good place to start. It is always important, though, to keep our biases in view and to be questioning our priors to make sure that they hold up. So first question Sire asks, and that we'll be asking throughout the year in each worldview, is what is really real? What is that which underlies reality as we know it? The second question, what is the nature of external reality, that is the world around us, then goes from what's really real to what is the nature of the world that we experience. Now, what is the nature does imply what is it to some degree. Again, some see the world merely as material, others only as spirit, while others see it as a mix of physical and immaterial. But this question also encompasses such designations as created with purpose or autonomous and accidental. This question, what is the nature of external reality, also asks, is it chaotic or is it orderly? Is the emphasis to be placed on our subjective personal relationship to the world or its objectivity apart from us? So all of that is going on in asking what is the nature of external reality. Very briefly, it's important that we all are on the same page when it comes to subjective and objective. So let's just take a second and make sure that we all understand the difference between subjective and objective. When it comes to subjective and objective truth, this is the easiest way to remember it. Subjective truth finds its truth in the subject. Objective truth finds its truth in the object. So objective truth, if I say there's a chair there, that statement is true based on whether or not there's actually a chair there. If I say there's an elephant here, that's objectively wrong because you're all looking and you're saying there's no elephant there. That's objectively wrong. If I say I really like beautiful sunny mornings in the spring, that's the subjective truth. It finds its reality, it finds its truth in me. You might hate, I mean, what's wrong with you if you do, but you might hate sunny mornings in the spring. We can disagree on that. So, okay, difference between subjective, objective, makes sense? Yes. Third question, what is a human being? Answers here can range all the way from a being made in the image of God to a sleeping lowercase g God to an advanced naked ape to a really complex organic machine. These are all of the possible answers that we might run into in various worldviews to this question. Next to the prime reality question, it is my opinion that this is the most important question in determining other people's worldviews. How we see us, how we see human beings, tells me more about what somebody believes about the world than almost anything else. So keep that in mind as we go forward. What happens to a person at death? Nothing. We cease to exist, or transformation to some higher state, or reincarnation, we come back around again, or departure to some other realm or some other state. Think about how important this question is deep down for all people. We all die, and then what? Again, this is a key question in understanding how people view the world. Then we shift gears a little bit. Why? Sire asks, is it possible to know anything at all? Now, to some degree, this is still tied into the what are we questions. Notice it isn't how do we know. That's a different question. We'll get into that in a moment. But how can we know? What is it about us that is unique in making us creatures that can have understanding, can have rational thoughts? The answer to this question will fall somewhere on the scale of we're made in the image of an all-knowing God, and therefore we can know, all the way down to consciousness and rationality developed over time due to some evolutionary need that we established as a species. Somewhere in there is going to be the answer that we give to that question. How do we know right and wrong? Now, again, to some degree, this is still part of the last question. How do we know? But it's a very specific question about morals. How do we or have we determined what is right to do and think and say versus what is wrong or evil? And again, notice there is a bias at play here, but it is a relatively universal one. There is an assumption that there is such a thing as right and wrong, good and evil, in this question. Some people deny the reality of right and wrong. Most do not, and even those who say they do, don't really. It's pretty hard to find somebody who consistently holds that there's no such thing as right and wrong. So how do we know what is right and wrong? Some of the answers that, again, we'll look at some of this in more detail even this morning, hopefully, might be, how do we know right and wrong? Whatever feels good. Whatever feels right. Whatever best allows for my survival and the survival of my social species. Or because God is good, made us in his image, and we are able to know the good and do the good. Those are some possible answers to this question. What is the meaning of human history? There are actually probably more answers, possible answers to this question than you think there are if you've never looked at this before. The way that humans view history across the ages and across the world is actually probably more complex than you may realize if you've only ever studied history through a Judeo-Christian Western perspective. And then finally, what personal life-orienting core commitments are consistent with this worldview. If you think back to last week, and even if you look on your paper and think back to Sire's definition of a worldview as being a commitment, a fundamental orientation of the heart, how our view calls us to live is a big part of worldview. All of the questions we've been asking up to this point deal with determining what someone thinks. But very few of them actually deal with how those things might impact our lives and the way one lives. A worldview has personal implications about the way we think, act, and live out our day-to-day lives. And again, even within a specific worldview, many people might have slightly different answers as to how we should live out our lives when the core commitments are essentially the same. For instance, within a Christian worldview, different people may answer the question, what is the point of life as a Christian, differently. Some possible answers to this, as we'll talk about later, might be to fulfill the will of God, to seek first the kingdom of God, to obey God and enjoy him forever, to be devoted to knowing and loving God, to become more like Christ. Notice those are all similar, but they're all a little different. They have different emphases. And so how we might answer this question specifically, there's going to be some variance from person to person. The way someone lives out their life might look similar to others, but there are going to be specific ways that their thoughts, words, and actions will look different. For instance, you can have two people fall under the umbrella of naturalism as being their primary worldview, and yet they might answer how they might live in drastically different ways. One might say that realizing my personal potential is the highest aim or goal in life, while another might say that doing as much good for others is the truest purpose of life. Yet another might say that pursuing inner peace is the best aim of life. All of those can fall under the umbrella of naturalism, but they're all very distinct ways of living out one's life. So these are the big 8 questions that Sire uses. We'll come back to those as we come through each worldview. I said that understanding the times uses 10 lenses or frameworks for examining each worldview. I have them listed on that handout. They are theology, philosophy, ethics, biology, psychology, sociology, law, politics, economics, and history. How someone understands these areas of study and the answers they provide can help us to understand how they view the world and answer life's big questions. So let's make sure we're all on the same page. Now, some of this I will go through a little faster than I do with my students, partly because I assume at least some of us have some knowledge in some of these already. I don't have to explain basic economics and that sort of thing. But also because in a group like this, we're going to have some of those differences of opinion that we already talked about, and we don't need to get in the weeds on some of that. So we're just trying to make sure we all understand what the lenses mean. We're not really at this point trying to say what is absolutely right or wrong under each one. Understanding the times begins with the lens of theology. Now, again, notice the inherent bias here. If the first lens we use to examine a worldview is theology, there's an inherently religious and probably Christian bias to this question. What someone believes about God or the gods is primary in understanding their worldview. And again, I don't disagree with this, so I think it's valuable and it's a good place to start. But it's still useful to realize the bias. All right, theology is, theo is Greek for God, ology is study, I just gave you the answer. Ology means study of, so theology is the study of God at its most basic, its most broad. There are 3 basic theistic positions that one can take. Either God or the gods is personal and independent of the universe. This is what we call theistic. Or he or it is identical to or one with the universe, what we would call pantheistic. Or there is no theistic being or force that is atheistic. These are the only real three possible. Now there's we can trim this down, we can find degrees of differences, but there are essentially only three theistic possibilities at play. Either theism, there is a god or gods that exist independent of the created world. Pantheism, the deity or deities are part of the physical world. Or atheism, there are none. Obviously, those who would reject the idea of theology as a valid lens by which their worldview can or should be examined are showing their own bias. Their bias toward the idea that only that which is open to scientific study is suitable for finding truth. And therefore, that precludes having a metaphysical question like this as part of the examination process. But even here, we can see how that bias is just as pervasive and potentially blinding as the biases of those of us who hold a theistic position. Every worldview has a theological position, even if the theological position is there is no deity. That is still a theological position, making this a valid question, a valid lens by which to examine worldview. Sire's questions, the first question about what exists comes into play here. I'm going quickly through this part because it's not as relevant to us. The second question of Sire, it helps us to understand external reality, comes into play. The fourth question about how we know and what happens at death, why we know, all of that comes into play here. You're all smart people. I don't need to tie Sire into understanding the time, so we're going to keep moving along. Philosophy. Any questions on theology before we move on? Everybody understand the three basic theistic possible positions? Good. Philosophy, at its root, philo, Philadelphia, love, philo, love of, Sophia, now Mark, wisdom. At its heart, at its root, philosophy is the love of wisdom. Historically, that's what it's always meant. It's come to mean different things in more modern times, but we're going to stick with the original definition. Toward our end of looking at philosophy in its historical sense, philosophy has historically looked to answer three significant questions. The third of those questions is, how then shall we live? That's the question of ethics. We'll deal with it as its own lens, and so I'm not going to deal with it under this lens. So the other two questions, and then we'll actually add a cheat, like a separate little question in here in a moment. But the primary question that the ancient philosophers all the way through the 1400s began with was, what is really real? Again, remember, this is Sire's starting place. As we talked about at that time, many modern people, that is those of us post-Enlightenment, don't see this as a valid starting place, as they place knowing before being. But again, for most of human history, this is the prime question. And so although it does betray my bias, I do see this as a valid starting place. I've used the word metaphysical a few times now, but we should define that a little bit better so that we're all in the same place. Meta, the root or the prefix here, meta, in this usage means above, beyond, or outside of. So metaphysics, outside of the physical world. Now, the word meta has come to mean some different things in our culture. Those of you who are above a certain age maybe aren't even aware of that. Those of you who are under a certain age hear this probably more frequently. Meta in our culture, in our current Western understanding, can also mean about something. And so in modern usage, a meta theory is a theory about theories, or a meta joke is a joke about jokes. Again, meta is often used, my students use meta as a standalone word all the time, not usually understanding what it even means when they use it. They're just using it in the way that our culture uses it. In this usage, though, it means a commentary about something as if from outside the whole thing. So a movie about the process of making a movie is a super meta movie, man. Like, it's really meta. Like, I don't know if you get it, but it's like meta. If you have teenagers, maybe that works a little bit better. It's just, you get it or you don't get it. It's just meta. So in philosophy, or even in theology, metaphysics is the question of what is really out there? What is the furniture of the universe? When I'm teaching historical philosophy as a college class, not this class, but as a college class, I always begin with, if we're going to understand what these different terms mean, let's imagine for a moment that this room is all of reality. Just for a moment, to try and understand this term, imagine that everything that exists is in these four walls, this roof, this ceiling, this floor. Metaphysics is the question of what's in the room. Metaphysics is the question of what's in the room. Now, some of it's obvious. These chairs, all of you lovely people. But then it's stuff also like light. It's things like thoughts, colors. Those are all things that exist in this space. So the question of metaphysics, what is in the room? Yes? Good? There are two possible metaphysical categories which answer this question, either monism or dualism. Monism is the idea that all reality is, all that really is made up of one type of thing. In other words, everything is spiritual or incorporeal, or everything is material. Dualism, on the other hand, proposes that both material and immaterial stuff really exists. There's both a physical world and an incorporeal world, that which we cannot see. So, pop quiz, is Christianity a monistic or dualistic metaphysical does Christianity hold a monistic or dualistic metaphysical position? Dualistic. We believe that there is both body and soul. Anybody want to hazard a guess? Can you think of any monistic worldviews or metaphysical positions? Materialism. The idea that everything is just matter. There's a lot of people who are monistic, or at least believe they are. They may not really be. If you want to go in the other direction, most forms of Buddhism tend to be monistic as well, believing that everything is actually just spirit, and any belief that we have physical bodies is just a belief that we don't actually exist physically. Those are two forms of monism. So everyone, whether they know it or not, believes that the world is either made up of one type of substance or that there are two types of substance in the world, whether we can see or measure these substances or not. So I'm not going to ask you to answer this out loud, but for a moment, just in your own head, think to yourself, what are some of the implications of holding one view or the other? What are some of the implications of being a monist versus being a dualist? How does that play out in the way we live our lives? Some of the questions that must be wrestled with, regardless of whether one holds to a monistic or dualistic view, are: what does it mean to be, to exist? Those of you who care about such things, that's actually the question of ontology. Ontology is the study of being, the study of what is and what isness means. So one of the questions that we wrestle with under the broader category of metaphysics is, what does it mean to be or not to be? That is the question. Whether it is nobler in the sorry. So what does it mean to be, to exist? Another question, if you're a monist, for instance, and believe that we are just one type of substance, then what is mind? What is thinking? Is there such a thing as a soul? Another question we might ask here is, are all concrete particulars, like this chair or that wall, are all things concrete particulars, Or can there be particular immaterial things that exist as well? Do numbers exist? Do numbers have being? Do numbers have essence? Does God exist? This is a metaphysical question. And what does it mean for God to exist? Does truth exist? Does beauty exist? Is there such a thing as beauty? These are all ontological, metaphysical questions that we should ask when in examining what we believe and also asking other people what they believe. How do you know that something is what it is? Are there universal categories that help us to know what things are? Is there such a thing as dogness or chairness? How do you know this is a chair? What makes this a chair and not your lazy boy a chair? Or are they both chairs? What about my rolling chair? What about a stool? Is a stool a chair? Is a bench a chair? Or is it just a bench? What's the difference between a bench and a chair? These are all metaphysical questions. This is actually really fun. I love when I teach philosophy and we get to this stuff at the first time and they're all like, I hate this. It's a chair because we call it a chair. That's nominalism. Look it up later. What about humanness? Or more abstractly, what about love, justice, and kindness? Are those things? And if they are things, what sorts of things are they? So, first question under philosophy, metaphysically, what is really real? What is the prime reality in the universe? Any big questions before I keep going? Second, how do we know? This is the question of epistemology. How do we know what we think we know about all those metaphysical questions I was just asking? How do we gain knowledge? What does it mean to know something? This is the field of epistemology. Just as with metaphysics, there are two historically dominant answers to this question, either empiricism or rationalism. An empiricist observes the world around them, determining knowledge through the application of their senses, what we see, what we can measure, what we can weigh. Empiricism is external observation. Science, as we tend to think about it today, is an empirical form of study. It depends on the process of making hypotheses. You all remember the scientific method. You make a hypothesis and you do experimentation and you see if it works. You run tests to prove and disprove hypotheses. Empiricism tends to view the human mind as a blank slate, what John Locke called the tabula rasa. We're all born as blank slates. And then we learn through the accumulation of knowledge and wisdom gained through the processes of observation and education. A rationalist, on the other hand, begins with the assumption that we have the primary means of gaining knowledge and wisdom already in and with us as part of our makeup. Truth is found through contemplation, through the application of our rational selves. So thinking about the metaphysical question of what is really real, does God exist, the pure empiricist would have trouble coming to a positive conclusion regarding that question. There is little empirical evidence, as we understand it to work, that God exists. If we are purely empiricists, that's a difficult question to come to a positive answer on. The rationalist, however, can, by use of deductive reasoning, come to the conclusion that certain things seem to point to there being a higher intelligence, and therefore perhaps God does exist. Now, most of us, almost nobody in the modern world, is purely an empiricist or a rationalist. Most of us are some blend of those. But we all tend to lean in one direction or another. And quite honestly, modern people tend to be more dependent upon empirical thinking than rational thinking overall. We tend to, as a society, trust our senses more than our contemplations. So again, just for yourself, sort of think through what are some of the implications of giving priority to empirical knowledge over rational or rational over empirical. Any questions on what epistemology is or what it's asking. I'm going to sneak one cheat question in here that understanding the times sneaks in, and so it's worth our looking at just very briefly. The final issue, and it's actually an ontological issue again, is the question that is often known as the mind-body question, or the mind-body problem. Philosophers dating back to the ancient Greeks have struggled to understand or explain how our physical corporeal bodies impact or are impacted by our non-corporeal minds. How does feeling attracted to someone and desiring to want to touch them result in our reaching out and taking their hand? And how does your immaterial mind then process the various feelings and emotions going through you when they react favorably and they squeeze back? That question of how does mind and body interact is an interesting, fascinating question that, quite honestly, we still don't know the answer to. This is, again, for me, one of those things that leads me to believe Christianity is true. It's far too complex of an answer for science ever to get to the root of. If a worldview is dualistic in nature, then the idea that there's material and immaterial stuff in the universe is clearer than a monist, but how those two things interact is still mysterious. So how a worldview answers or attempts to answer the mind-body problem also helps get to the root of what it means to be human. It has significant implications for what happens after death, if we're just material stuff. And again, I'm going to jump over how this all ties into Cyrus' questions. We'll pick it up as we go through the course. All right. Boy, 12 minutes. We're going to try. We're going to try really hard to get through ethics. As previously mentioned, ethics is a branch of philosophy. Let me just say right now, if you have questions for me on this ethics stuff, please just come see me at the end. It's going to be far easier. I don't mind answering questions, but we'll get in the weeds really fast if I'm trying to answer lots of questions out loud. Okay. All right. So we're going to deal with ethics as its own thing here. How and whether we can know right and wrong, and then what we should do about it. This is what falls under the category of ethics. Now, just so we're all on the same page, morals and ethics tend to be used interchangeably, and they can be. There's no problem with using the words morals and ethics interchangeably. Just if you're curious, morality is typically an individual system of determining ethics, while ethics is the broader category name. Ethics is the study of moralities. If that's something that concerns me, now you know. There are quite a few specific ethical systems, but nearly all of them fall under one of four primary umbrellas. And so I'm going to look at those here for you. This is crash course in the four basic Western ethical systems that we can run into today. Three of them work together well, so we're going to look at those three first, and then I'll come back to the fourth one on its own. In order to begin looking at the first three categories, we need to know that every ethical choice or situation has three basic parts. There is the one doing something, the thing they are doing, and the outcome from their actions. So, if Sandy Palmer finds Wesley Speck's wallet in the parking lot after church, we're now going to call Sandy our actor. The actor, the one doing something. The action is when Sandy either decides to keep it because the Wes is loaded and she needs the money, or she decides to return it. That's the action that Sandy, the actor, is going to do. And then when Wes is either really angry and lashes out and like keys Sandy's car, or when he's eternally grateful because she says, listen, thank you for the money. I'm going to bake you cookies every day for the rest of your life. He's like, that's a win. So at that point, we have a consequence to the action. Every ethical situation has three parts: the actor, the action, and the consequence. So I'm going to use this framework to spell out these first three ethical systems. The first system we're going to look at is what's known as virtue ethics, or sometimes it's called eudaimonian ethics. The virtue ethicist, stick with me, this all makes more sense as we go along. Just for right now, go with it. Virtue ethics asks, what kind of person is performing the action. In other words, a virtue ethicist is primarily concerned with the actor. Is the actor virtuous? The virtue ethicist believes that good actions come from good people. If Sandy is a certain type of person, then she's going to do a certain type of action. A good person will typically do what is good. Deontological ethics, sometimes known as Kantian ethics, because Immanuel Kant, who probably made the most famous version of this, so some people just call it Kantian, but if you want the more technical term, it's deontological. A deontological ethicist looks primarily at the action. A person is acting rightly when they are doing good things, when they are making good choices. The root here, deon, is Greek for duty. That is the thing that you are supposed to do. And so if a virtue ethicist is most concerned with the actor, and a deontological ethicist is most concerned with the action, whether or not they're doing their duty, the third category is most concerned with the consequences of the action. Helpfully, this is referred to as consequentialism. Another name that's related and often used interchangeably here is utilitarian ethics. Perhaps you've heard that term. The consequentialist is most concerned with the consequences of any given action. They would say that a good moral choice is the one that has the right outcome. Now, obviously, determining what is right is an important thing to figure out in using utilitarian ethics, knowing the right outcome. But for each of these models, who or what is good is determined through a different set of questions or observations. For the virtue ethicist, the actions of the good person are the good actions. The deontological guy says that we can know who is good based on whether they do good things. And the utilitarian guy says that the good person is the one who looks ahead to the outcome and picks their action based on the assumed outcome and its consequences. So to make this a little easier, let's look at a specific instance. Again, Sandy finding Wes's wallet. I'm actually going to begin with the deontological system because it makes everything make a little more sense if I start there. Immanuel Kant introduces to us the concept of the categorical imperative. What is an imperative? Something that must be done. And so a categorical imperative is a moral action that must be done regardless of circumstance or our own inclinations or desires. We can simplify this further by saying that in any given ethical situation, the categorical imperative says you should only do that which you think everyone else should do in a similar circumstance. More to the point, since this is an ethic based on logic and rationalism, the categorical imperative asks, is it possible for everyone to want to do this all at once? What would be the outcome of being able to make a universal law that says that everyone should steal property that they find? What's going to be the outcome if there's a universal law that says if you find lost property, you should take it for yourself? Chaos. We don't want to live in that world. So the deontologist says, well, if it doesn't logically make sense that everyone should do this action in a given situation, then no one should do this action in a given situation. If Sandy is a good deontologist, she's returning Wes's wallet because she doesn't want everyone else in the world to steal if they have the opportunity. If there is the opportunity to do the right action, then you must do the right action. Can somebody kill someone else if they hate them enough? Well, can we say that everyone should kill someone else? Can we make that a universal law? Obviously not. Therefore, should you ever kill anyone, the deontologist says, no, there is never justification for killing someone according to the deontological method. Would I want there to be a rule that everyone should have to do this particular action? If the answer is no, the deontologist says, don't do it. Now, the strength of this model is it leads to moral absolutes. That's why some people prefer this model. It is a very black and white ethic. It leads to clear moral absolutes. Should you ever lie? Well, what would it be like if there was a universal law that says everyone must lie? I mean, do you want others to lie to you? If not, you should never lie. So the Kantian ethicist says, follow moral absolutes. Okay? Everybody get deontological ethics? Good for you. That was like a 3-minute explanation and you all got it. Let's keep going. Utilitarian or consequentialist ethics. This is a system that uses a different question in order to establish right and wrong. The most common form of utilitarianism asks, what outcome will make the most people happy? So if the utilitarian looks at Sandy finding Wes's wallet and says, will returning the wallet make more people happy, or will her keeping make more people happy? Now, in most situations, obviously, probably her returning it is the greatest happiness. But what if, here's why, right? Wes is happy with Sandy. Sandy feels good about herself for having done the right thing. Other people hear about Sandy and say, what a swell gal that is. She does nice things. She's so sweet. We already say that, Sandy, but it would be even more so. But what if Sandy, because she's also very manipulative and she's a deep thinker, what if Sandy says, ooh, what if I take the money and I buy food and clothes for the poor and the destitute? Wes isn't happy, but that's a lot of happy people, right? And so the utilitarian might well say that this was the good act, not immoral in any way, because she has made the most people happy. Wes is lost out, but everybody else is like, wow, what a good person Sandy is. She bought lots of food for the poor. It is worth noting that most Western corporations and governments run on this form of ethical decision making. Oh, doggone it. Imagine you're on the board of a large car company. Tens of thousands of a particular vehicle have been produced when it suddenly becomes clear that there is a defect in the seatbelts. On one hand, it takes a very particular type of accident for that defect to matter. However, the mortality rate is incredibly high should that circumstance occur. And so people will die, but it's a really small number. A recall, on the other hand, is going to cost millions of dollars to the company and its shareholders. The company might go under, which would cause thousands to lose their job. So what is right? 5 dead people and their grieving families versus thousands out of a job facing poverty or worse, unable to care for their families. The Kantian would say what here? The deontologist says you can never tell a lie. So therefore, you have to do the recall. A real good utilitarian, on the other hand, is going to say, greatest happiness for the greatest number. That's the more important factor. Our third ethical system, just because I want you to at least have the foundation, we'll have to pick up on this next week, but I just want you to have the foundation, then we'll come back to this, go from here. Our third ethical system, commonly known as virtue ethics or eudaimonian ethics, started by Aristotle. He's the first person to lay out this ethical system. Building off of the ideas laid by Plato, he proposes that happiness, or eudaimonia, is the aim of good living. It's important, though, to realize that happiness in the ancient world meant something very different than the weak and watered down thing that we mean when we say happiness today. A better translation of eudaimonia might be human flourishing or well-being. This isn't a feeling, I'm happy today. This is, and it's not dependent upon immediate circumstances that might change in an instant. This is about being the best person you can be, the good man or the good woman. So according to Aristotle and many of the Christian philosophers who come after him, the way to achieve this good life or happy life is to pursue living virtuously or living excellently. The Greek word arete, often translated as virtue here, literally means to be excellent in every way. And so living virtuously or excellently typically means pursuing the mean. The virtue is nearly always found somewhere between the extremes. For instance, eating well or eating virtuously means eating appropriately, not overeating, but likewise not under eating. Enjoy good foods when they're available to you, but don't constantly pursue rich, luxurious foods. Aristotle's most famous example is courage. What is courage? Well, it's not being too cowardly on one hand or being too foolhardy on the other. If one is in a battle, they should not be hanging back, letting all of their fellow soldiers rush forward without them, too scared to fight. But likewise, it is not virtuous to charge the cannons alone, thereby assuring one's own death. Courage, says Aristotle, is living in the golden mean of the best possible wellness. So, what does it mean to work well, to work virtuously? Don't be too lazy. Work well, work hard, but likewise, don't let work be the thing that you do to the exclusion of all else. Keep it in its rightful place. Note that the opposite of a virtue is a vice. Vices are the over-pursuing or under-pursuing of the good. And so a vicious person is one who is unvirtuous. There are far more vices than virtues, far more ways to go wrong than to go right. And so for the person who lives this way, who is striving to be virtuous in all areas, this is the starting point for virtue ethics. The good person, who are they? Not what do they do, because being precedes action. We are out of time. I'm going to pick up here next week. I'll give a really quick recap and then we'll keep going from here. If you have any questions, please come see me. In the meantime, let me pray and off we go. Lord, thank you. Thank you for being with us. Thank you for giving us hearts and minds that reflect yours, for making us in your image that we might learn and study and grow in love and excellence. And we pray that you will be with us today and this coming week. May we grow in sanctification and being more like Christ. It's in your name we pray.
So under theology, is that or that like
Gnosticism is a blending of both the philosophy of knowledge, so there's gnosis, but that's the root there is knowledge. So it's a blending of how do we know with a theological position of how we know is out there somewhere. So it's like we'd be taking the question of theology, like ask that again.
like the meta theology.
Yes. So meta-theology would be saying, what can we theologically say about theology? So meta-theology is more of a study of, like, should we be asking the question about theism versus atheism? That's more of it. Yeah. Right. It's almost above the question. Most of us are starting at the question of what is. That's our primary question. Meta-theology is saying, should we even be asking that question? Is it a valid question? Does that make sense?